Hello, my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and I am here today to read McBroom's wonderful 1 Acre Farm. And I am reading this especially for my granddaughter, Charis, who asked me if I could find the book. So my library didn't have this book, and I had to go to the interlibrary loan and order the book, and it finally came in. And so now I am going to read it for Charis and for all of you who are listening. It should be a fun one. Chapter 1, McBroom tells the truth. There has been so much tomfool nonsense told about McBroom's wonderful 1 Acre Farm that I had better set matters straight. I'm McBroom, Josh McBroom. I'll explain about the watermelons in a minute. There's a picture of Josh McBroom about to tell us the truth about his farm. I aim to put down the facts, one after the other, the way things happened. Exactly. It began, you might say, the day we left the farm in Connecticut. We piled our youngsters and everything we owned in our old air-cooled Franklin automobile. We headed west. To count noses, in addition to my own, there was my dear wife, Melissa, and our 11 red-headed, freckle-faced youngsters. Their names were Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda. It was summer, and the trees along the way were full of birdsong. We had got as far as Iowa when my dear wife, Melissa, made a startling discovery. We had 12 children along, one too many. She had just counted them again. I slammed on the brakes and raised a cloud of dust. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda, he shouted, line up. The youngsters tumbled out of the car. I counted noses, and there were 12. I counted again. 12. It was a baffler, as all the faces were familiar. Once more, I made the count, but this time I caught Larry slipping around behind. He was having his nose counted twice, and the mystery was solved. The scamp! Didn't we laugh, though, and stretch our legs in the bargain? Just then, a thin, long-legged man came ambling down the road. He was so scrawny, I do believe he could have hidden behind a flagpole, ears and all. He wore a tall, stiff collar, a diamond stick pin in his tie, and a black hat. So here is the picture of the tall, thin, long-legged stranger. He is very tall, thin, and long-legged. Lost, neighbor? He asked, spitting out the pips of a green apple he was eating. Not a bit, said I. We're headed west, sir. We gave up our farm. It was half rocks and the other half tree stumps. Folks tell us there's land out west and the sun shines in the winter. The stranger pursed his lips. You can't beat Iowa for farmland, he said. Maybe so, I nodded, but I'm short of funds. Unless they're giving farms away in Iowa, we'll keep a-going. The man scratched his chin. See here, I've got more land than I can plow. You look like nice folks. I'd like to have you for neighbors. I'll let you have 80 acres cheap. Not a stone or a tree stump anywhere on the place. Make me an offer. Thank you kindly, sir, I smiled, but I'm afraid you would laugh at me if I offered you everything in my leather purse. How much is that? $10. Exactly. Sold, he said. Well, I most choked with surprise. I thought he must be joking, but quick as a flea, he was scratching out a deed on the back of an old envelope. Hector Jones is my name, neighbor, he said. You can call me Heck Everyone does. Well, was there ever a more kindly and generous man? He signed the deed with a flourish, and I gladly opened the clasp of my purse. 3 milky white moths flew out. They had been gnawing on the $10 bill all the way from Connecticut, but enough remained to buy the farm, and not a stone or a tree stump on it. Mr. Heck Jones jumped on the running board and guided us up a mile of the road. My youngsters tried to amuse him along the way. Will wiggled his ears, and Jill crossed her eyes, and Chester twitched his nose like a rabbit. But I reckon Mr. Jones wasn't used to youngsters. Hester flapped her arms like a bird. Peter whistled through his front teeth, which were missing, and Tom tried to stand on his head in the back of the car. Mr. Heck Jones ignored them all. Finally, he raised his long arm and pointed. "There's your property, neighbor," he said. Didn't we tumble out of the car in a hurry? We gazed with delight at our new farm. It was broad and sunny, with an oak tree on a gentle hill. There was one defect, to be sure. A boggy-looking pond spread across an acre beside the road. You could lose a cow in a place like that, but we had got a bargain, no doubt about it. "Mama," I said to my dear Melissa, "see that fine old oak on the hill? That's where we'll build our farmhouse." "No, you won't," said Mr. Heck Jones. "That oak ain't on your property." "But, sir, all that's yours is what you see underwater. Not a rock or a tree stump in it, like I said." I thought he must have been having his little joke, except that there wasn't a smile to be found on his face. "But, sir," I said, "you clearly stated that the farm was 80 acres. "That's right. That marshy pond hardly covers an acre." "That's wrong," he said. "There are a full 80 acres, one piled on the other, like griddle cakes. I didn't say your farm was all on the surface. It's 80 acres deep. McBroom, read the deed." I read the deed. It was true. "Hee-haw, hee-haw," he snorted. "I got the best of you, McBroom. Good day, neighbor." He scurried away, laughing up his sleeve all the way home. I soon learned that Mr. Heck was always laughing up his sleeve. Folks told me that when he'd hang up his coat and go to bed, all that stored up laughter was poured out of his sleeve and kept him awake nights. But there's no truth to that. I'll tell you about the watermelons in a minute. Well, there we stood, gazing at our 1-acre farm that wasn't good for anything but jumping into on a hot day. And the day was the hottest I could remember. The hottest on record, as it turned out. That was the day, 3 minutes before noon, when the cornfields all over Iowa exploded into popcorn. That's history. You must have read about it. There are pictures to prove it. I turned to my children. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda. I said, "There's always a bright side to things. That pond we bought is a mite muddy, but it's wet. Let's jump in it and cool off." That idea met with favor, and we were soon in our swimming togs. I gave the signal, and we took a running jump. At that moment, such a dry spell struck that we landed in an acre of dry earth. The pond had evaporated. It was very surprising. My boys had jumped in head first, and there was nothing to be seen of them but their legs kicking in the air. I had to pluck them out of the earth like carrots. Some of my girls were still holding their noses. Of course, they were sorely disappointed to have that swimming hole pulled out from underneath them. But the moment I ran the topsoil through my fingers, my farmer's heart skipped a beat. That pond bottom felt as soft and rich as black silt. "My dear Melissa," I called, "come look. This topsoil is so rich it ought to be kept in a bank." I was in a sudden fever of excitement. That glorious top seed seemed to cry out for seed. My dear Melissa had a sack of dried beans along, and I sent Will and Chester to fetch it. I saw no need to bother plowing the field. I directed Polly to draw a straight furrow with a stick, and Tim to follow her, poking holes in the ground. Then I came along, and I dropped a bean in each hole and stamped on it with my heel. Well, I had hardly gone a couple of yards when something green and leafy tangled my foot. I looked behind me. There was a beanstalk traveling along in a hurry and looking for a pole to climb on. "Glory be!" I exclaimed. "That soil was rich." The stalks were spreading out all over. I had to rush along to keep ahead of them. By the time I got to the end of the furrow, the first stalks had blossomed. The pods were formed, and they were ready for picking. Can you imagine our excitement? Will's ears wiggled. Jill's eyes crossed. Chester's nose twitched. Hester's arms flapped. Peter's missing front teeth whistled. And Tom stood on his head. "Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda," I shouted. "Harvest them beans!" Within an hour, we had planted and harvested that entire crop of beans. But it was hot working in the sun. I sent Larry to find a good acorn along the road. We planted it, but it didn't grow near as fast as I had expected. We had to wait an entire 3 hours for a shade tree. We made camp under our oak tree, and the next day we drove to Barnesville with our crop of beans. I traded it for various seeds, carrot and beet and cabbage and other items. The storekeeper found a few kernels of corn that hadn't popped at the very bottom of the bin. But we found out that corn was positively dangerous to plant. The stalk shot up so fast it would skin your nose. Of course, there was a secret to the topsoil. A government man came out and made a study of the matter. He said there had once been a huge lake in that part of Iowa. It had taken thousands of years to shrink up to our pond, as you can imagine. The lake fish must have got packed in worse than sardines. There's nothing like fish to put nitrogen in the soil. That's a scientific fact. Nitrogen makes things grow to beat all, and we did occasionally turn up a fishbone. It wasn't long before Mr. Heck Jones came around to pay us a neighborly call. He was eating a raw turnip. When he saw the way we were planting and harvesting cabbage, his eyes popped out of his head. It almost cost him his eyesight. He scurried away, muttering to himself. "My dear Melissa," I said, "that man is up to mischief." Folks in town had told me that Mr. Heck Jones had the worst farmland in Iowa. He couldn't give it away. Tornado winds had carried off his topsoil and left the hard pan right on top. He had to plow it with wedges and a sledgehammer. One day, we heard a lot of booming on the other side of the hill, and my youngsters went up to see what was happening. It turned out he was planting seeds with a shotgun. Meanwhile, we went about our business on our farm. I don't mind saying that before long we were showing a handsome profit. Back in Connecticut, we had been lucky to harvest 1 crop a year. Now we were planting and harvesting 3-4 crops a day. But there were things we had to be careful about. Weeds, for one thing. My youngsters took turns standing weed guard. The instant a weed popped out of the ground, they'd race to it and hoe it to death. You can imagine what would happen if weeds ever got going in rich soil like ours. We also had to be careful about planting time. Once we planted lettuce just before my dear Melissa rang the noon bell for dinner. While we ate, the lettuce headed up and went to seed. We lost the whole crop. One day, back came Mr. Heck Jones with a grin on his face. He had figured out a loophole in the deed that make the farm ours. "Hee-haw," he laughed. He was munching a radish. "I got the best of you now, neighbor McBroom. The deed says you were to pay me everything in your purse, and you didn't." "On the contrary, sir," I answered, $10. There wasn't another cent in my purse. There were moths in the purse. I seen 'em flutter out 3 milky white moths, McBroom. I want 3 moths by 3 o'clock this afternoon, or I aim to take back the farm. Hee-haw. And off he went, laughing up his sleeve. Mama was just ringing the noon bell, so we didn't have much time. Confound that man, but he did have his legal point. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda, I said, we've got to catch 3 milky white moths. Hurry. We hurried in all directions, but moths are next to impossible to locate in the daytime. Try it yourself. Each of us came back empty-handed. My dear Melissa began to cry, for we were sure to lose our farm. I don't mind telling you that things looked dark. Dark. That was it. I sent the youngsters running down the road to a lonely old pine tree and told them to rush back with a bushel of pine cones. Didn't we get busy, though? We planted a pine cone every 3 feet. They began to grow. We stood around anxiously, and I kept looking at my pocket watch. I'll tell you about the watermelons in a moment. Sure enough, by 10 minutes to 3, those cones had grown into a thick pine forest. It was dark inside, too. Not a ray of sunlight slipped through the green pine boughs. Deep in the forest, I lit a lantern. Hardly a minute passed before I was surrounded by milky white moths. They thought it was night. I caught 3 on the wing and rushed out of the forest. There stood Mr. Heck, waiting with the sheriff to foreclose. Hee-haw, hee-haw, old Heck laughed, and he was eating a quince apple. It's nigh to 3 o'clock, and you can't catch moths in the daytime. The farm is mine. Not so fast, Neighbor Jones, said I, with my hands cupped together. Here are the 3 moths. Now, skedaddle, sir, before your feet take root and poison ivy grows out of our ears. He scurried away, muttering to himself. My dear Melissa, I said, that man is up to mischief. He'll be back. It took a good bit of work to clear the timber, I'll tell you. We had some of the pine milled and built ourselves a house on the corner of the farm. What was left we gave away to our neighbors. We were weeks blasting the roots out of the ground. But I don't want you to think there was nothing but work on our farm. Some crops we grew just for the fun of it. Take pumpkins. It was something to see. The youngsters used to wear themselves out running after those pumpkins. Sometimes they'd have pumpkin races. Sunday afternoon, just for the sport of it, the older boys would plant a pumpkin seed and try to catch a ride. It wasn't easy. You had to grab hold the instant the blossom dropped off and the pumpkin began to swell. Whoosh! It would yank you off your feet and take you whizzing over the farm until it wore itself out. Sometimes they used banana squash, which was faster. Here's a picture of the sheriff and the tall, thin, long-legged man, and there is McBroom holding his 3 moths to seal the deal on the farm. And here, down here, is a picture of the children taking a ride on a pumpkin. See the pumpkin's vine? And the pumpkin just goes rooming off, I guess. That's pretty cool. Okay, so now the girls learned to ride cornstalks like pogo sticks. It was just a matter of standing over the kernel as the stalk came busting up through the ground. It was good for quite a bounce. We'd see Mr. Heck standing on the hill in the distance watching. He wasn't going to rest until he had pried us off our land. Then, late one night, I was awakened by a hee-hawing outside the house. I went to the window and I saw old Heck in the moonlight. He was cackling and chuckling and heeing and hawing and sprinkling seed every which way. I pulled off my sleeping cap and rushed outside. What mischief are you up to, Neighbor Jones? I shouted. Hee-haw, he answered and scurried away, laughing up his sleeve. I had a sleepless night, as you can imagine. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, that farm of ours broke out in weeds. You never saw such weeds. They heaved out of the ground and tumbled madly over each other. Chickweed and milkweed and thistles and wild morning glory. In no time at all, the weeds were all in a tangle several feet thick and still rising. We had a fight on our hands. I tell you, Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda. I shouted, there's work to do. We started hoeing and hacking away. For every weed we uprooted, another reseeded itself. We were a solid month battling those weeds. If our neighbors hadn't pitched in to help, we'd still be burning weeds. The day finally came when the farm was cleared, and up popped old Heck Jones. He was eating a big slice of watermelon. That's what I was going to tell you about. Howdy, neighbor McBroom, he said. I came to say goodbye. Are you leaving, sir? I asked. No, but you are. I looked him squarely in the eye. And if I don't, sir? Why, hee-haw, McBroom. There's heaps more of weed seed where that came from. My dander was up. I rolled back my sleeves, meaning to give him a whipping he wouldn't forget. But what happened next saved me the bother. As my youngsters gathered around, Mr. Heck Jones made the mistake of spitting out a mouthful of watermelon seeds. Things did happen fast. Before I had quite realized what he had done, a watermelon vine whipped up around old Heck's scrawny legs and jerked him off his feet. He went whizzing every which way over the farm. Watermelon seeds were flying. Soon he came zipping back and collided with a pumpkin left over from Sunday. In no time, watermelons and pumpkins went galloping all over the place, and they were knocking him about something wild. He streaked here and there, melons crashed and exploded. Old Heck was so covered with melon pulp he looked like he'd been shot out of a ketchup bottle. It was something to see. Will stood there wiggling his ears. Jill crossed her eyes. Chester twitched his nose. Hester flapped her arms like a bird. Peter whistled through his front teeth, which had grown in. Tom stood on his head, and little Clorinda took her first step. By then, the watermelons and pumpkins began to play themselves out. I figured Mr. Heck Jones would like to get home as fast as possible, so I asked Larry to fetch me the seed of a large banana squash. Hee-haw, neighbor Jones, I said, and pitched the seed at his feet. I hardly had time to say goodbye before the vine had him. A long banana squash gave him a fast ride all the way home. I wish you could have been there to see it. That's the entire truth of the matter. Anything else you hear about McBroom's wonderful 1-acre farm is an outright fib. Chapter 2. McBroom and the Big Wind. I can't deny it. It does get a mite windy out here on the prairie. Why, just last year, a blow came ripping across our farm and carried off a pail of sweet milk. The next day, it came back for the cow. But that wasn't the howling, scowling, almighty big wind I aim to tell you about. That was just a common little prairie breeze. No account, really. Hardly worth bragging about. It was the big wind that broke my leg. I don't expect you to believe that yet. I'd best start with some smaller weather and work up to that bone breaker. I remember distinctly the first prairie wind that came scampering along after we bought our wonderful 1-acre farm. My, that land was rich. Best topsoil in the country. There isn't a thing that won't grow in our rich topsoil. And fast as lightning. The morning I'm talking about, our oldest boys were helping me to shingle the roof. I had bought a keg of nails, but it turned out that those nails were a whit short. We buried them in our wonderful topsoil and watered them down. In 5 or 10 minutes, those nails grew a full half-inch. So there we were up on the roof, hammering down shingles. There wasn't a cloud in the sky at first. The younger boys were shooting marbles all over the farm, and the girls were jumping rope. When I had pounded down the last shingle, I said to myself, Josh McBroom, that's a mighty stout roof. It'll last 100 years. Just then, I felt a small draft on the back of my neck. A moment later, one of the girls, it was Polly, if I recall, shouted up to me. Pa, she said, do jackrabbits have wings? And I laughed, no, Polly. Then how come there's a flock of jackrabbits flying over the house? I looked up, and mercy, rabbits were flapping their ears across the sky in a perfect V formation, northbound. I knew then that we were in for a slight blow. "Run, everybody," I shouted to the young'uns. I didn't want the wind picking them up by the ears. "Will, Jester, Hester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda, in the house, scamper." The clothesline was already beginning to whip around like a jump rope. My dear wife, Melissa, who had been baking a heap of biscuits, threw open the door. As we dashed, and not a moment too soon. The wind was snapping at our heels like a pack of wolves. It aimed to barge right in and make itself at home. A prairie wind has no manners at all. We slammed the door in its teeth. Now the wind didn't take that politely. It rammed and bammed and battered at the door while all of us pushed and shoved and to hold the door shut. It was a battle. How the house creaked and trembled. "Push, my lambs," I yelled. "Shove." At times the door planks bent like barrel staves, but we held that roaring wind out. When it saw that there was just no getting past us, the zephyr sneaked around the house to the back door. However, our oldest boy, Will, was too smart for it. He piled Mama's heap of fresh biscuits against the back door. My dear wife, Melissa, is a wonderful cook, but her biscuits are terribly heavy. They made a splendid doorstop. But what worried me most was our wondrous rich topsoil. That thieving wind was apt to make off with it, leaving us with a trifling hole in the ground. "Shove, my lambs," I said. "Push." The battle raged on for an hour. Finally, the wind gave up, butting its fool head against the door. With an angry sigh, it turned and whisked itself away, scattering fence pickets as it went. We all took a deep breath, and I opened the door a crack. Hardly a leaf now stirred on the ground. A bird began to twitter. I rushed outside to our poor 1-acre farm. Mercy! What I saw left me pop-eyed. "Melissa!" I shouted with glee. "Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda. Come here, my lambs, and look." We all gazed in wonder. Our topsoil was still there, every bit. Bless those youngsters. The boys had left their marbles all over the field, and the marbles had grown as large as boulders. There they sat, huge agates and sparkling glassies, holding down our precious topsoil. But that rambunctious wind didn't leave empty-handed. It ripped off our new shingle roof, pulled out the nails too. We found out later the wind had shingled every gopher hole in the next county. Now that was a strong draft, but it wasn't a big wind. Nothing like the kind that broke my leg. Still, that prairie gust was an education to me. "Young'uns," I said, after we'd rolled those giant marbles down the hill, "the next uninvited breeze that comes along, we'll be ready for it. There are two sides to every flapjack. It appears to me the wind can be downright useful on our farm if we let it know who's bossed. The next gusty day that came along, we put it to work for us. I made a wind plow. I rigged a bed sheet and tackle to our old farm plow. Soon as the breeze sprang up, I'd go tacking to and fro over the farm, plowing as I went. Our son Chester once plowed the entire farm in under 3 minutes. On Thanksgiving morning, Mama told the girls to pluck a large turkey for dinner. They didn't much like that chore, but a prairie gust arrived just in time. The girls stuck the turkey out the window. The wind plucked that turkey clean, pin feathers and all. Oh, we got downright glad to see a blow come along. The young'uns were always wanting to go out and play in the wind, but Mama was afraid they'd be carried off. So I made them wind shoes, made them out of heavy iron skillets. Out in the breeze, those shoes felt light as feathers. The girls would jump rope with the clothesline. The wind spun the rope, of course. Many a time I saw the youngsters put on their wind shoes and go clumping outside with a big tin funnel and all the empty bottles and jugs they could round up. They'd cork the containers jam full of prairie wind. Then come summer, when there wasn't a breeze of air, they'd uncork a bottle or two of fresh winter wind and enjoy the cool breeze. Of course, we had to windproof the farm every fall. We'd plant the field in buttercups, My, they were slippery. All that butter, I guess. The wind would slip and slide all over the farm without being able to get a purchase on the topsoil. But then the boys and I had reshingled the roof. We used screws instead of nails. Mercy! Then came the big wind. And here's a picture of the children catching the wind in bottles and corking it up so that in the summer they would have some cool wind to enjoy. So now we talk about the big wind. It started out gently enough. There were a few jackrabbits and some crows flying backward through the air. Nothing out of the ordinary. Of course, the girls went outside to jump the clothesline, and the boys got busy laying up bottles of wind for summer. Mama had just baked a batch of fresh biscuits. My, did they smell good. I ate a dozen or so hot right out of the oven, and that turned out to be a terrible mistake. Outside, the wind was picking up ground speed and scattering fence posts as it went. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda, I shouted, inside my lamb. That wind is getting ornery. The young'uns came trooping in and pulling off their wind shoes, and not a moment too soon. The clothesline began to whip around so fast it seemed to disappear. Then we saw a hen house come flying through the air, with the hens still in it. The sky was turning dark and mean. The wind came out of the far north, howling and shrieking and shaking the house. In the cupboard, cups chattered in their saucers. Soon we noticed big balls of fur rolling around the prairie like tumbleweeds. Turned out they were timber wolves from up north. And then an old hollow log came spinning across the farm and split against my chopping stump. Out rolled a black bear, and was he in a temper. He had been trying to hibernate and didn't take kindly to being awakened. He gave out a roar and looked around for somebody to chase. He saw us at the windows and decided we would do. The mere sight of him scared the young'uns, and they huddled together, holding hands, near the fireplace. I got down my shotgun and opened a window. That was a mistake. Two things happened at once. The bear was coming on, and in my haste, I forgot to calculate the direction of the wind. It came shrieking along the side of the house, and when I poked the gun barrel out the window, well, the wind bent it like a angle iron. That buckshot flew due south. I found out later it brought down a brace of ducks over Mexico. But worse than that, when I threw open the window, such a draft came in that our young'uns were sucked up through the chimney. Holding hands, they were carried away like a string of sausages. Mama near fainted away. My dear Melissa, I exclaimed, don't you worry. I'll get our young'uns back. I fetched a rope and rushed outside. I could see the young'uns up in the sky and blowing south. I could also see the bear, and he could see me. He gave a growl with a mouthful of teeth like rusty nails. He rose up on his hind legs and came toward me with his eyes glowing red as fire. I didn't fancy tangling with that monster. I dodged around behind the clothesline. I kept one eye on the bear and the other on the young'uns. They were now flying over the county seat and looked hardly bigger than magflies. The bear charged toward me. The wind was spinning the clothesline so fast he couldn't see it, and he charged smack into it. My, didn't he begin to jump. He jumped red hot pepper, only faster. He had got himself trapped inside the rope and just couldn't jump out. Here's a picture of all the children flying up out of the chimney. Aren't we glad they were holding hands? Of course, I didn't lose a moment. I began flapping my arms like a bird, and that was such an enormous, big wind, I figured I could fly over after the young'uns. The wind tugged and pulled at me, but it couldn't lift me an inch off the ground. Tarnation, I had eaten too many biscuits. They were heavy as lead and weighed me down. The young'uns were almost out of sight. I rushed to the barn for the wind plow. Once out in the breeze, the bed sheet filled with wind. Off I shot like a cannonball, plowing a deep furrow as I went. Didn't I streak along, though? I was making better time than the young'uns. I kept my hand on the plow handles and steered around barns and farmyards. I saw haystacks explode in the wind. If that wind got any stronger, it wouldn't surprise me to see the sun blown off course. It would set in the south at high noon. I plowed right along and gained rapidly on the young'uns. They were still holding hands and just clearing the treetops. Before long, I was within hailing distance. "Be brave, my lambs!" I shouted. "Hold tight!" I spurted after them until their shadows lay across my path. But the bed sheet was so swelled out with wind that I couldn't stop the plow. Before I could let go of the handles and jump off, I had sailed far ahead of the young'uns. And here he is with his wind plow. And there he's sailing past the young'uns. I heaved the rope into the air. "Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda," I shouted as they came flying overhead. "Hang on!" Hester missed the rope, and Jill missed the rope, and so did Peter. But Will caught it. I had to dig my heels to the earth to hold them, and then I started back. The young'uns were too light for the wind. They hung in the air. I had to drag them home on the rope like balloons on a string. Of course, it took most of the day to shoulder my way back through the wind. It was a mighty struggle, I tell you. It was near supper time when we saw our farmhouse ahead, and that black bear was still jumping rope. I dragged the young'uns into the house. The rascals, they had had a jolly time flying through the air, and they wanted to do it again. Mama put them to bed with their wind shoes on. The wind blew all night long, and the next morning that bear was still jumping rope. His tongue was hanging out, and he had lost so much weight he was skin and bones. Finally, about mid-morning, the wind got tired of blowing one way, and so it blew another. We got to feeling sorry for that bear, and we cut him loose. He was so tuckered out, he didn't even growl. He just pointed himself toward the tall timber to find another hollow log to crawl into. But he had lost the fine art of walking. We watched him jump, jump, jump north until he was out of sight. That was the howling, scowling, almighty big wind that broke my leg. It had not only pulled up fence posts, but the holes as well. It dropped one of those holes right outside the barn door, and I stepped into it. And that's the bottom truth. Everyone in the prairie knows Josh McBroom would rather break his leg than tell a fib. And then the last one that we're going to read is McBroom's ear, which we have already read in another story. So we'll read it again. But that's all for today. And Grandma Carla will be back with some more later. This is Grandma Carla, and I love you.